I know. Yeah, Christmas. That's right. I told you. Exactly. All right. Well, good morning. It's good to see you this morning. We're starting a little bit late, which is probably not the morning to start late because we have a lot of material to get through. Daryl's passing out a handout. Um, we have to go through a lot of history this morning, which if you're a history buff like me, you enjoy it. If not, you might struggle a little bit this morning, but it's necessary to understanding Daniel chapter 11 because that's essentially all that Daniel chapter 11 is about. We've seen so far within the book of Daniel that one of the primary messages to Daniel and to the people of Israel is that God is sovereign over history. That He is sovereign over the events that have happened in their life. And essentially, He is sovereign over the destiny of Jerusalem and the people of Israel, which is primary. In fact, we kind of have followed this story arch from the beginning of the deportation to Babylon, the destruction of Jerusalem that really begins Daniel's adventures, if you will. And now we're kind of coming full circle to, as Daniel previously is questioning, what is going to happen to Jerusalem? What is going to happen to the people of Israel? Did everybody get a handout? Raise your hand if you didn't get a handout. Daryl will grab you one. What is going to happen to the people of Israel? That's Daniel's chief concern. One of the things that's been revealed to Daniel so far is that Babylon will not be the last tyrant nation, the last empire to cause problems for Israel. There's going to be others to come. In fact, there's going to be one in particular that's terrifying. But the promise has been that all through this, God is going to preserve His people through suffering, and that He ultimately is going to bring about His reign throughout the world. That His kingdom will come to fruition, and that all nations will be submitted under the reign of God. So, we now come to Daniel chapter 11, which is by far the most extensive and detailed prophecy that we have seen up to this point. And we're going to have to kind of rush through some of this material, unfortunately, but that's why I gave you the handout so that you can maybe have, somewhat of an idea of what we're discussing at the end of it. But let's quickly begin with a word of prayer. Blessed Father, we come before you this morning, Lord of glory and goodness, and we give you all the glory and honor and praise. Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for your truth, and we pray that you will benefit us and help us and aid us as we seek to know your will and seek to come to submit to it and to trust in your sovereign hand in history and in our lives. It's in your Son's blessed name that we pray. Amen. All right, so let's begin with Daniel chapter 11. Let's just start. We'll read quickly through verses 1 and 2, and then we'll discuss what he means there. As for me, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood up to confirm and to strengthen him, and now I will show you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia, and the fourth shall be far richer than all of them. And when he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up against the kingdom of Greece. We'll go down to read verse 3. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do as he wills. So we're given this snippet into there's going to be 3 more kings and then a fourth within the Persian Empire, which is going to be greater than all the previous ones, which within history shows us to be true. There was Cambyses, there was Smyrtus, there was Darius the first, or often referred to as Darius the Great. And then in 486, Xerxes came into power, who is the Ahasuerus of Esther. Xerxes was by far the most dominant Persian king and the most wealthy. He increased his wealth beyond that of previous kings. And notice that it says that he shall become strong through his riches. He shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece. So he says within the reign of Xerxes, he's going to stir up the powers of Greece, which he did. His father previously, Darius the Great, tried to conquer Greece and he failed. But Xerxes tries and he mounts an attack against Greece. Of course, he wins at Thermopylae, for those who know history, but then he fails within the Battle of Salamis, the navy battle there. So, this is what he's speaking of here within Persia. Now we get down to verse 4. It says, and as soon as he has risen, now he's talking about the mighty king of Greece. Now who's the mighty king of Greece? Excuse me, Alexander. His kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the four winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor according to the authority with which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others besides these. So here he is speaking, of course, of, as we've mentioned before, and Alexander has come up prior to this, is that at kind of the height of his power, Alexander is going to be cut off. And his kingdom, which is what happened in history, kind of at the height of Alexander's dominance, he dies, around the age 30, 33, and his two sons are killed as well. His two young sons are killed. So his kingdom does not go to his posterity. It goes essentially to his four generals that we previously discussed. One of those that is most important to us comes from the Seleucid line, which rules Syria and the Palestinian area. And so this is, again, I know that this might be dry to some of you, but it was very important to Daniel and to his companions to know that God was watching over these subsequent events that were going to occur. Now let's look at verses 5 and 6. Then the king of the south shall be strong. Now, whenever you read the king of the south, we're talking about the Ptolemy kingdom of Egypt that took over after the Ptolemies took over Egypt after the Grecian Empire was dispersed. The Seleucids took over the northern part of the kingdom, Syria and Palestine, in that area, and Palestine. And so now, whenever you hear the kingdom of the north, we're talking about the Seleucids. The kingdom of the south, we're talking about the Ptolemies. And so the kingdom of the south shall be strong, but one of his princes shall be stronger than he and shall rule, and his authority shall be great authority. After some years they shall make an alliance, and the daughter of the kingdom of the south shall come to the king of the north and make an agreement. But she will not retain the strength of her arm, and he and his arm shall not endure. But she shall be given up in her attendants, he who fathered her and he who supported her in those times. What in the world is he talking about here? Well, essentially, he's talking about what we know in history as the First and Second Syrian Wars. During this time, Egypt and Syria, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies go back and forth in battle. And in order to ensure a peace agreement, in about 252 BC, which they brought it into what was referred to as the Second Syrian War, when Ptolemy's daughter, Berenice, was married to Antiochus II, who was of the Seleucid Empire. So they try and kind of do this peace agreement where he gives his daughter, and that's what he's talking about here in verse 6. After some years they shall make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south, which is Ptolemy's daughter, Berenice, shall be given to the king of the north. But notice that it says that she will not retain her power. The daughter will not retain her power. Well, she didn't retain her power, because in order for Antiochus II to marry Berenice, he had to divorce his then wife, whose name was Laodice. I don't really know how to pronounce her name, to be honest with you. But he had to divorce her. Well, she wasn't very happy about that. And so she actually ended up poisoning Berenice, killing her, and she had Berenice's son assassinated as well so that he could not take over the throne. So this whole plan for a peace agreement between them failed miserably. And thus her own father, Ptolemy I, her own father, who had hoped to gain some inroads into the Seleucid Empire by this peace agreement, notice it says his power fails. It says that in verse 6. His kind of plans to bring in his own influence fails. And you can see that within the handout there that I gave you, how it says in verse 6, Antiochus II, by an alliance, by marriage to Bernice, the southern kingdom to Antiochus II. All right, so now let's read verses 7 through 9. And from a branch from her roots one shall arise in his place. He shall come against the army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he shall deal with them and shall prevail. He shall also carry off to Egypt their gods with their metal images, their precious vessels of silver and gold. And for some years he shall refrain from attacking the king of the north. Then the latter shall come into the realm of the king of the south, but shall return to his own land. Here we're talking about the Third Syrian War, which happened from about 246 to 241. Just get used to hearing Syrian War because there's a lot of them. All right, there's a lot of them. So, can someone grab me some water, a bottle of water? Oh, Sarah's already prepared. I don't want to take your water, so thank you. See, I need people like stations where they have water bottles, like that. You can just throw it to me. Thank you. So we're talking now about the Third Syrian War. Now, Berenice's brother. So Berenice is the one that was poisoned and murdered, who was the part of the peace agreement. Her brother, Ptolemy II, wasn't very happy about his sister being murdered. And so he invades Seleucid territory. He kills Laodice, the woman who killed Bernice, and he pretty much almost completely conquers Seleucid. He advances almost as far as Babylon. And notice that he says he enters the fortress of the kingdom of the north, which was at this time Seleucia, which was the capital. And he takes a lot of their gods, he takes a lot of their idols, he takes a lot of their wealth, and he brings it back to Egypt. But interestingly enough, for some reason, he doesn't continue his conquests. He doesn't try and conquer them completely, which is what is mentioned here in the latter half of verse 8. For some years he shall refrain from attacking the king of the north. Don't really know why. I don't know if he didn't want to push his luck. But he just goes back to Egypt and he doesn't conquer them completely. After that, as it says in verse 9, then the latter shall come into the realm of the king of the south, but shall return to his own land. So essentially that's when Seleucus II, who is Antiochus' son, comes in and conquers some of the land that previously was taken. All right, now let's look at verses 10 through 12. His son shall wage war and assemble a multitude of great forces, which shall keep coming and overflow and pass through, and again shall carry the war as far as his fortress. Then the king of the south, moved with rage, shall come out and fight against the king of the north. And he shall raise a great multitude, but it shall be given into his hand. And when the multitude is taken away, his heart shall be exalted, and he shall cast down tens of thousands, but he shall not prevail. Now we're talking about the Fourth Syrian War, which happened from about 219 to 217. There's some things that happened between the previous war and that one. But this is when Antiochus the Great, as you will notice in your timeline there in verses 15 and 16, Antiochus the Great attempts to attain Palestine in that area, and which was a major move because the Ptolemies had control of this area essentially since they took over it in 301. And he raises this immense force, and he's essentially thinking that he's just going to go back in there and conquer Egypt, but he doesn't, and it doesn't work, which is why it says he has to turn back, and many people die because of his efforts in verse 19. All right, now let's look at verses 13 through 16, which we'll call the growth of the Seleucid kingdom. This is the period that begins to have a little bit more significance for us because it's from this outgrowth of the Seleucid kingdom which Antiochus IV, or Antiochus Epiphanes, which we've previously discussed, is going to come. And so Verses 13 through 16. For the king of the north shall again raise a multitude greater than the first, and after some years he shall come on with a great army and abundant supplies, and in those times many shall rise against the king of the south, and the violent among your own people shall lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they shall fail. Then the king of the north shall come, throw up siege works, and take a well-fortified city, and the forces of the south shall not stand, or even his best troops, for there shall be no strength to stand. In verse 16, but he who comes against him shall do as he wills, and none shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his hand. So now what we have within the time of Antiochus the Great is that there is this great expansion of the Seleucid Empire and the control of Israel and other areas. Antiochus III begins which is Antiochus the Great, begins his Fifth Syrian War from 202 to 195 against Ptolemy V. And Antiochus conquers Gaza, which is the well-fortified city, which he is speaking of in this area. And what's very interesting is that the Israelites that were living in the region during this time were not fans of the Ptolemies. And so they rise up to help the Seleucids try and conquer the Ptolemies, which is what he mentions here in verse 14. In those times many shall rise against the king of the south, and the violent among your own people shall lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision. So the Israelites, interestingly enough, are fighting for, during this time in history, the very empire that is going to greatly persecute them in a few years after this with Antiochus IV. And notice he's saying they're doing this and they're fulfilling this vision and they're not even aware of it. They're under the assumption that they're helping their own liberation when in fact they're actually giving way to their captors. So there's some irony there. All right, now let's read verses 17 through 19. He shall set his face to come with the strength of his whole kingdom. He shall bring terms of an agreement and perform them. He shall give him the daughter of women to destroy the kingdom, but it shall not stand or be to his advantage. Afterward he shall turn his face to the coastland, shall capture many of them. But a commander shall put an end to his insolence. Indeed, he shall turn his insolence back upon him. Then he shall turn his face back toward the fortress of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and shall not be found. Now, this is, again, Antiochus III, Antiochus the Great, trying to continue his expansion. But notice it says in verse 17 that he gives him the daughter of women. This is another peace agreement that Antiochus tries to give. He gives Cleopatra I, his daughter, in marriage to Ptolemy V. But his plans to kind of, once again, this happened quite a bit, trying to use your daughter as a political play to get dominance in another kingdom. It didn't work because Cleopatra was more loyal to her husband than she was to her own father. In fact, there was a short time where Cleopatra ruled while her son was too young to rule after the death of her husband. It says he turns his attention to the coastlands, which speaks of the Asia Minor area around the regions of Bulgaria, modern-day Bulgaria. But notice that it says a commander, where does it say? 18, a commander shall put an end to his insolence. Well, interestingly enough, this is even now, even this early on, we're talking about 191 BC or so. So it's really prior to Rome becoming as dominant as they are, but their power has already grown at this point to where they are a dominant voice in the Mediterranean world. The commander that he's speaking of is a Roman commander. I forget his name at the moment. But a Roman commander who essentially told him, you need to stop your expansion in Asia Minor. Well, Antiochus is like, what, you're going to tell me to stop? Well, yes, he did, and he conquered him. At another battle of Thermopylae in 191, Thermopylae was a key battle point. And his final, so that's what he's talking about, is he puts an end to his insolence, this idea of him being insolent, and thinking that he can conquer these areas and just look over Rome, was this insolence that he had. Now, verse 19 speaks of the death of Antiochus III. Notice that it says, he shall turn his back toward the fortress of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and shall not be found. So what happened to Antiochus is that after he's conquered, he kind of returns back to the land, and he finds, what he views as a rebellion that's happening in the kingdom of Elam, which it wasn't really a rebellion, but he tries to go in and to rob the temple of Baal in that area. Well, the people get angry, and they rise up and they kill him because he tried. Now, you're going to see some similarities. This is between him and Antiochus IV and trying to plunder temples and it not working out very well for them. But, that's how he was killed, and that's what it's speaking of in verse 19. Okay, so now we're going to get in verses 21 through 35 into the area of Antiochus Epiphanes, which is the key character of this time. Now, we're talking, again, now we've, during this entire period, the reason that some of this doesn't sound very familiar to you and why, some of you are falling asleep is because it's between the Testaments. This is the period that happened. You ever wonder what happens between the closing of the Old Testament and the opening of the New Testament? This is what's happening. And all of this that's happening is formative to the world that Jesus is going to know when he comes into the picture. Prior to the closing of the Old Testament, there was no such thing as synagogues. And you open up the New Testament, all of a sudden you hear these things called synagogues. Where did synagogues come from? What happened during this time? Prior to the Old Testament closing, there were no such thing as Pharisees and Sadducees. And all of a sudden we open up the New Testament, and there's these groups of people called Pharisees and Sadducees who have pretty significant voices in the Jewish culture. How did they come about? How did that happen? Why did they come about? All of that's happening now. It might be a silly question to ask, but does anybody have any questions or comments? I know that you can probably quote these names in your sleep, and I expect you to know all of these dates by the next class period. All right, so now let's read verses 21 through 35. In his place shall rise a contemptible person, to whom royal majesty has not been given. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken, even the prince of the covenant. And from the time that an alliance is made with him, he shall act deceitfully and shall become strong with a small people. Without warning, he shall come into the richest parts of the province. He shall do what neither his fathers nor his fathers' fathers have done, scattering among them plunder, spoil, and goods. He shall devise plans against strongholds, but only for a time. He shall stir up his power and his heart against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall wage war with an exceedingly great army and mighty army, but he shall not stand. For a plot shall be devised against him. Even those who eat his food shall break him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. And as for the two kings, their heart shall be bent on doing evil. They shall speak lies at the same table, but to no avail, for the end is yet to be at the time appointed. And he shall return to his land with great wealth, but his heart shall be set against the holy covenant. And he shall work his will and return to his own land. I want to go ahead and stop there because this is a significant part within Israelite history, specifically verse 28. And notice that it refers after Antiochus III comes in, there is a contemptible person that shall arise. Now, between Antiochus III and Antiochus IV, there was Seleucus IV. Now, he didn't reign very long, very short reign. And some people actually think that Antiochus IV killed Seleucus, or at least plotted to kill him. Now, interestingly enough, Antiochus IV was a captor in Rome for much of his younger life because of, remember when his father, Antiochus III, he was trying to expand in Asia Minor. I told you about that Roman commander that said, don't do it, don't do it. And he went doing it. Well, once he conquered him at Thermopylae in 191, one of the conditions of the peace agreement was that Antiochus III give his son as a captor to Rome. And so, which is Antiochus Epiphanes. So Antiochus Epiphanes, the fourth, was in Rome for much of his earlier life, which is going to play a significant role later on. But anyways, in verse 28, it's talking about this failed Egyptian campaign that Antiochus IV has. Now, Ptolemy the Sixth was reigning during this time, which was actually Antiochus' nephew. And he thought, well, hey, I can just kind of work with Ptolemy and I can conquer Ptolemy. But Ptolemy was a double agent and essentially thwarted Antiochus' plans. And so Antiochus comes in there thinking that, he's going to be able to easily conquer Egypt, only to find that his nephew has conspired against him with his brother and sister to thwart him conquering Egypt. Well, Antiochus is a very arrogant man. He's very intelligent, extremely intelligent. Did you notice how it says, he came by royal powers through flattery and through conniving, through deceit? That's the type of man that he is. He's very intelligent. He's very smart. But he's also, the perfect word to describe, he's very contemptible. He doesn't care about the kind of honors and the regalities of statehood. All he concerns about is the exaltation of his own person, which is why, by the way, he gives himself the title Antiochus Epiphanes, which means Antiochus, God manifest. And so Antiochus likes himself some Antiochus. And so so when he comes back and he's conquered by his nephew, he's not very happy about it. And he's really not happy when he comes into Israel and he finds a rebellion there. And the rebellion was due to the fact that Antiochus had replaced the high priest with a different high priest because that high priest had paid Antiochus more money. So by the way, there's already some corruption going on within Israel, which is going to give rise to a little group of individuals who are very concerned with the keeping of the law, who are very concerned with preserving Jewish heritage against the encroaching Grecian culture, and they are known as the Pharisees. The origin of the Pharisees was actually very commendable. They were deeply concerned with the influence of the Grecian culture upon the Jewish nation, and many Jews were giving way to that through the creation of, for example, gymnasiums and things of that nature in which the younger people were influenced through sports and through culture. Sounds very familiar, doesn't it? And so the Pharisees rise in response to that as a means of calling the people back to a submission of the law. And so when Antiochus comes back, he's not happy about this uprising. He kills a lot of people and plunders the temple. He takes the bread of the table, the bread of the presence. He takes the lampstand. He takes the veil. He takes a lot of the things that are important to the temple worship. Now look at verse 29. At the same appointed time, or at the time appointed, notice this, at the time appointed. And one of the things you need to notice in this is over and over again, the vision's going to mention that, at the appointed time, at the appointed time, at the appointed time. Well, if a time is appointed, what does that imply? That this isn't just natural courses of events that are happening without God being concerned about it. God has set these things up, and God is governing them and directing them as He desires for His purpose. Verse 29. At the time appointed He shall return and come into the south, but it shall not be this time as it was before. For ships of Kittim shall come against him, and he shall be afraid and withdraw, and shall turn back and be enraged and take action against the holy covenant. He shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the holy covenant. Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. He shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, but the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. And the wise among the people shall make many understand, though for some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. And when they stumble, they shall receive a little help, and many shall join themselves to them with flattery. And some of the wise shall stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made white until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time. And the king shall do as he will. Well, let's go ahead and stop there, actually, verse 35. Okay, so now we see in verse 29, it says that he's the king of the north, which is Antiochus IV. He said he's going to try and go back into Egypt and conquer Egypt. But it's not going to be as it was before. Well, the reason is that it wasn't as it was before is because when Antiochus IV decides, I'm going to go back in Egypt and try and conquer it, he's actually pretty successful. In fact, he's so successful that he gets on Rome's radar. And you don't want to get on Rome's radar because they're not the dominant power they're going to be in a little bit, but they're still very a dominant voice at this time. And so whenever he starts really conquering Egypt, the Ptolemies and the Empire of Greece goes running to Rome. They're like, hey, look what he's doing, look what he's doing. And so now these ships of Kittim, which he mentions here, that comes against him, are speaking of the allied forces of Egypt, Greece, and Rome coming against Seleucid. And notice that it says, he was afraid. Well, why was he afraid? He's been so dominant so far. Remember what I told you about Antiochus being a prisoner in Rome when he was a younger man? Now, this is maybe me reading a little bit too much into it, but who knows better the power of Rome than a little boy who was imprisoned in Rome for many, many, many years? Antiochus does. And Antiochus knows better than to go against Rome. So he flees. Well, if he was mad the first time he had to flee, imagine how mad he is the second time. So he comes back, he's on his way back, and he comes through Israel again, and guess what's happening again? What always happens in Israel, which is a rebellion. Another rebellion's happening. So he is mad, and he takes all of his fury out from this defeat onto the people of Israel, because he hates them anyways, because in Antiochus' mind, the entire kingdom needed to be united under a singular God, or under a singular set of gods, he himself being the chief representative of those gods, the epiphanies that God manifests, and yet he's got this little stubborn group of people over here that refuse to submit. And so what does he do? He completely desecrates the temple, slaughters pigs on the altars, kills thousands of Jews, sets up an image of Zeus within the temple, which is referred to as the abomination of desolation. He makes the temple a temple dedicated to Zeus, which is this phrasing of the abomination that makes desolate, which it was made desolate. I mean, he stopped the burnt offerings. If you offered a burnt offerings or if you circumcised your sons, you were killed. You were punishable by death. He essentially made it impossible to be a Jew. And so that's what's happening. It's one of the most devastating moments in Jewish history prior to the Roman destruction of Jerusalem. It was a significant moment in their history. But from this, Antiochus assumed too much, because notice it said in those verses that there's going to be a small group of people that rise up and reject this and refute it. And this small group of people was what is often referred to in history as the Maccabean Revolt. Because Matthias Maccabee, who was an aged priest, he had 5 sons. You've probably heard of them before, Judas, Jonathan, and Simon in particular, who played a big role. The Maccabean Revolt against Antiochus Epiphanes started whenever in the town of Modin, one of the Jews was going up to offer sacrifices to the pagan idols, and Matthias, this old man, just couldn't take it anymore, and he went up to him and he killed him. Killed him right there on the spot before he could even make the sacrifice. And that kind of began, Judah the Hammer and all of these revolts. They take back Jerusalem. They take back a small region of Israel, which begins what's referred to as the Hasmonean Dynasty. And this is where the Pharisees come into more significant play. And with Judas the Hammer, with his help, the temple was cleansed and rededicated on December 25th in 168 BC, which is now known as what? Hanukkah, right? If you've ever wondered what Hanukkah is about, this is where Hanukkah has its origins. Whenever the Maccabees conquer the Seleucids, they reclaim the temple, they cleanse it from the idolatrous practices that were done in it, and they rededicate it to God. And so, interestingly enough, it becomes this very significant holiday, which plays a part in the New Testament as well, within Hanukkah. So, we have about 5 minutes. That's just a quick summary of all these things that Daniel's talking about. Now, if you're a Jew, this is important, because essentially Daniel has outlined everything that's going to happen in these successive years for the Jewish people. And he's helping them to see, as you can see, that, okay, Egypt's down here, Syria's up here. Who's in between them? Israel is. And so whenever Syria and whenever Egypt go into battle, who's right in the middle of it? Israel is. So this period of 200 years is very, 200 to 300 years, very, very difficult for the Israelite people. And so God wants them to know that, listen, there's going to be difficult times coming, but notice that he also says, number one, these times are appointed, and number two, in the midst of these difficult times, did you catch how he says there's going to be a remnant that's going to be purified? There's going to be a remnant that's made clean. even in the midst of all of these difficult times, there's going to be a group of people that are going to purify and cleanse themselves, that are going to answer these struggles and be refined by them so that they can stand up to the challenges that are coming. And so that is a key and important part within all of this. In fact, look at verse 10 of chapter 12. Many shall purify themselves and make themselves white and be refined, but the wicked shall act wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but those who are wise shall understand. Notice also in verse 8, notice Daniel's question. I heard, but I did not understand. And this is something that we mentioned previously. That even though, and of course, you got to look at this from Daniel's perspective. He's being told all of this, and he's like, okay, I mean, what does that mean? Some king of the north and king of the south? At that point, Daniel's perspective, Alexander he didn't even know who the great king is that's going to rise and conquer Persia. And so this is very confusing to him. And he says, I don't understand. And notice what he asks. Then I said, oh my Lord, what shall be the outcome of these things? Notice, you're telling me that all of these things are going to happen in Jerusalem, and all of this is going to occur, but what's going to be the outcome? What's the end goal here, God? What's the purpose of all of this? And notice what the response is. The angel says, go your way, Daniel, for the words are shut up and sealed till the time of the end. And then notice in verse 13, he says it again, but go your way till the end, and you shall rest and shall stand in your allotted place at the end of days. That's the end of Daniel. I don't understand all that you're talking about. It's okay, Daniel, you don't have to. He doesn't give him an answer. He reveals something. He says you need to seal this up, which the idea of sealing doesn't necessarily mean hiding it. It means the idea of preserving it for the future generations who would understand this. Well, how would they understand it? Because they're going through it, right? And they're going through this, and they're looking at these documents, and they're saying, well, we knew this was coming, right? This is what God, so that means that God's got control of this, and it's going to be okay. So it became a map for future generations. And notice that he says previously, in 12, 1 through 2, he goes to the end of time, and he talks about the resurrection. Look at verse 1. At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince, who has charge of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never been seen since there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. So now he's even looking at, he is looking at the destruction of Jerusalem, which he's talking about there, about the destruction of Jerusalem, but he ties that into the final destruction of the world. So there's some overlap here. And notice that he says there at the end, he says, Daniel, go your way. Go your way. I've given you this revelation. You don't understand it, and it needs to be preserved for future generations. But notice what he says, and you shall rest. What does that mean? You're going to die, Daniel. But notice what he says. But you shall stand in your allotted place at the end of days. What's that tying back to? That's tying back to the resurrection that he just previously spoke about, which the resurrection is actually not talked about very much in the Old Testament. This is one of the first kind of more explicit statements. Some would argue in the book of Job, but I think this is the more explicit statement here where he's talking about this. He says, Daniel, this is for future generations. You're going to die, but you're going to rise again, and I've got a spot for you, Daniel. All through these years, you have stood in the spot that I told you to stand. All these years you've been faithful to me, and you have been exactly where you were supposed to be. And in the end, Daniel, you're going to be exactly where you're supposed to be. And that's the message to the people of Israel throughout all successive generations, is that if you remain faithful to me, if you stand where you're supposed to be, at the end of it all, at the end of days, you're going to be right where you need to be. I'm going to ensure that. Through all of these difficulties, through all of these trials, through the entire course of history, I will preserve you and I will keep you. John, do you have a comment?
exception translation is done during this time we're talking about reading here. Greek philosophy and thought has permeated the Mediterranean world, so that Paul utilizes it. They can go to the libraries like Ephesus. People have a question, not everybody's going to have a copy of the Old Testament. They can go to the library at Ephesus, Philadelphia, libraries that have been, archaeology has unearthed. And they say, okay, well, here's a copy of the Greek translation of the Scripture. These guys were told and coming that this kingdom, and we demonstrate the proof that the Scripture was in place and it's reliable, trustworthy. You can know that for certain this is the Christ.
Mm-hmm. Well, and what's interesting also is that this Grecian culture that they were rightfully concerned about also at the same time played an important part in forming the world into which the gospel was spread, right? The dominance of Greek within the Mediterranean world and the usage of it amongst the common people. Like you said, the translation of the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. Okay? And that's, by the way, the main translation that Paul quotes from within the New Testament. He quotes a lot from the Septuagint. And so it's just a reminder that interestingly enough, sometimes the very things that we need to be on guard against are the means that God uses to bring about great things for His kingdom. And so it's interesting. But all of this is the formative years of the world into which Jesus was born. And there's this little empire in the Mediterranean world that has become slowly and slowly more dominant during this time that has helped to stave off the Seleucid Empire from growing. And its name is Rome. And by the time that Jesus, of course, comes into the picture, it is the dominant power. But prior to Jesus, the power that concerned the Jews was the Seleucid kingdom, which caused them immense amounts of suffering prior to their final destruction in AD 70. All right. The ancient Philadelphia, which is named after